We're about to get into some serious code, but before we do, I want to mention a couple terms. The first is authentication. Authentication involves verifying that a user is indeed who he or she claims to be. Typically, this is done by checking a provided username and password against what is stored in a database, and this is exactly what we'll do. To manage authentication, we'll be adding a user entity to our application, and this class will implement Spring's user details interface. The user entity will encapsulate a user's username, password, whether or not the account is enabled, as well as a role. More on roles in a moment. The next term I want to mention is authorization. This happens after authentication and involves checking an authenticated user's permissions to see if she or he is allowed to access a requested resource or perform a requested action. To manage authorization, we'll add a role entity. We might define one role for user, one for user admin, and one for app admin. These roles are meant to grant different authorities or privileges to users. We then assign one or more roles to each user, which ends up determining what each user has access to do. For more granular control over authorities, we could create an entity that encapsulates specific authorities, but for this workshop, we'll focus on higher level roles. Think of roles, in our case, as sort of a named access level. With that in mind, let's create those two entities. We'll start with the role class. I will stick that in the model package. So new Java class role. The role entity will be pretty straightforward at first. It will have a long ID and a string name. As I said earlier, it's just a named access level. For example, we could have one role for regular users and one for admin users. Let's stick those fields in there now. I said we'd have a long ID and we'd have a string name. Let's also add our JPA annotations. So we'll annotate the class with entity. We'll annotate the ID field with the ID annotation and indicate that this should be a generated value. We'll use the strategy of generation type dot identity here. Now, I'll use my IDE to generate getters and setters. Generate getters and setters for both of those. There we go. And that's good for now in the role entity. So now that we've coded the role entity, let's add to our role table by editing the import.sql file. So that's in the resources directory, import.sql. Here we'll insert just one role named role_user. We'll use the role_ naming convention because that's what's used by Spring. My intention here will be to use this role for a general purpose user that has no admin rights. And I'll do that before I insert these tasks. Let me stick a comment up top. Insert roles. Well, we'll just insert one role here. Insert into role. The name column will contain the value role_user. Cool. Now let's create that user entity. So again, in the model package, I'll right click, new Java class, and create a user class. This entity will have an ID, username, password, a field to track whether or not this account is enabled, and a role field. So let's create all those fields now. So we'll create an ID. That'll end up being the primary key of the user entity in the database. We'll have a username in here. So private string username. We'll have a password. We'll track whether or not this account is enabled. And we'll also track this user's role. Next, let's add those JPA annotations. So again, I'll annotate the class with entity. I'll annotate the ID with our typical annotations, ID and generated value, using that same strategy, generation type dot identity. Now I'm going to add some column annotations to a few of these fields just so that I can further tell HBM to DDL what these columns should look like. So I'll use the column annotation here, and I'll say that the username must be unique. Unique equals true. Let's make sure we import that column annotation as well. I'll also throw in a validation constraint. I'll say the username must be at least 8 characters in length. Oops, that's min equals 8, not minus 8. And it can be up to 20 characters in length. Cool. I'll say the password can be up to 100 characters in length. Now, there's a reason for this astronomical length I am putting in here, and we'll get to that much later in the workshop. And as far as the enabled field goes, I'll add a column annotation there and say that it's not nullable, which means its value cannot be null in the database. The way we'll get Spring to recognize this user class as one to integrate with Spring Security is to implement the user details interface. So let me implement that interface now. Implements, user details. There it is right there. And now let's add the unimplemented methods from that interface. Implement methods. Okay. So I'll add all these methods, even though we'll focus our attention on just one of them. And that is this getAuthorities method. Now, what we want to make sure before we code that method is we want to make sure all of these other methods return appropriate values that are going to allow authentication to succeed. So, is the account enabled? Well, we actually have a field for that, so we'll return enabled. We have, if you recall, that enabled field up top. Moving on to the next one. Is credentials non-expired? Here we will say true. The credentials are non-expired. Careful, this non in here, that negative here could make this method confusing. Is account non-locked? Yes, the account is non-locked. We can track further locking of accounts through enabled and a locked field if we want to. We're not doing that. Is account non-expired? We'll say yes, the account is not expired. Username, we have a username. Password, we have a password. Okay, now back to this getAuthorities method. This getAuthorities method is one that Spring expects to return a list of what are called granted authority objects. An authority can be a detailed action that a user has permission to perform, or it can be broad like the roles that we're using. We'll stick to broad in this workshop, but know that with additional work, you could define roles as user access levels, each level having a predefined list of authorities. You can be as granular as you like. Okay, let's implement this method. Our approach will be quick since we aren't getting any more granular than roles. To further simplify measures, each user in our app has only one role, so our work is a matter of adding one granted authority to the list based on the user's assigned role. We'll do that by creating a new array list of granted authorities and adding what's called a simple granted authority for the one role that the user has. So here's how that looks. We'll create a list of granted authorities. A list of granted authority objects. Make sure to import java.util.list. And I'll call that authorities. And I'll create a new array list. Cool. And to that array list, to that authorities, I will add one item. I'll add a new simple granted authority, and the name will come from whatever role this user has, its name. And then we will return that collection of granted authorities, which in our case is a list. Here in our user class, we can build the bridge between users and roles in the database by using the one-to-one annotation on the role. So let's do that now. One-to-one, right there. That is, one user has one role. And the next thing we'll need to do is consider how we're going to store the role that each user has been assigned. Let's choose a simple approach and store the role's ID as a role_ID column in the user table. And for this, we'll use the join column annotation that you've seen in previous Hibernate courses. I'll name that column role_ID. Great. With that set up, we're almost ready to fire up the app. But before we do that, let's go back to the import.sql file and add a couple users. To do this, we'll include a couple insert statements after the insert statement for the role. So here we'll insert 2 users. So we insert into user. The column names are username, enabled, and password. And the values are going to be, I'm going to say the first user's username is user. Yes, the user is enabled. The password is password, very difficult one to guess. And the role ID that I'm assigning to this user is the one role that will be present in the database. That is this role user. Now, I know that the generation strategy that we used here was the generation type.identity. And I know that assigns a unique integer sequentially starting with 1. So the first role that I insert into the table will have an ID of 1. So this user's role ID is 1. Now I'm just going to copy this entire insert statement, paste it, and I'll change this to user2, and it's going to have, this user is going to have the same role. So I'll leave that role ID in there as 1 right there. That should stay a 1. And at this point, we're ready to run our application and see if everything is associated correctly. We'll test this by seeing if our database tables are created correctly and rows inserted correctly. Let's run this thing and let HBM to DDL work its magic. And let Hibernate execute the queries in this import.sql file. So I will run that boot run tasks to do that. Let me pull up this panel here. Actually, I'll pull it all the way up. We're going to have a lot of output that we are interested in. So let's scroll up here and see if we can see our database tables being created correctly for users and roles. Okay, so we have a role table being created right here. We've got an ID and we've got a name, and the primary key is set as the ID field. Cool. The task was already there, so that we haven't touched, but here is our user table. ID enabled, password, username. There's that role ID right there. Primary key set as ID. You'll notice that the user table was altered to include a unique index on the username field. That is because in the user entity, oops, I better pull this panel down a little bit. In the user entity, I added this unique element to the column annotation. So HBM to DDL picked that up and set our usernames as unique in the database. Okay, let's see what else we have here. We also have in the user table a foreign key set on the role ID table, referencing the role table. So there's that association in the database between a user and its assigned role. Finally, we have 2 users being inserted into the database right here. Insert into user table, first user, and our second user right there. Excellent. Looks like we have some solid data and we're ready to move on to implementing user authentication in Spring.